I will start with my presentation, and I will then introduce the other members of the panel. And what I want to discuss is not related, as many of you may perhaps expect, to the direct relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We've been asked about it yesterday, and I want to say the following. In this session, we have one person who knows the subject and will not speak about it, namely Yaakov Amidror, and another one who doesn't know the fact and will speak about it, namely myself. So this can be a little frustrating, but what I would like to do is not to speak specifically about Israeli-Saudi relations at the moment, but to look at the rationale of the relations between Israel and its regional allies or elements in the region that we have cooperated with over a very long time. And I want to speak not only of the rationale, but also of the modus operandi of these relationship. And in this context, to speak about the position of Israel in the region in general. Because as you will see at the end of what I'm about to say, there is more to this relationship in terms of the impact on the region than meets the eye, because the relations have very often been clandestine. They couldn't come out of the open. They had a glass ceiling. They couldn't go beyond a certain point. But when they were effective, they had a major impact sometimes on the region in general. Now, Israel has a fundamental problem, a structural problem. Here is an element that is not Arab, not Muslim, and coming with a different kind of political culture in a region that is Arab and Muslim with a different kind of political structure. So you're looking for allies in the region. First of all, the non-Arab allies, such as Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia, the Kurds, if we speak about a non-state entity, and elements that are non-Muslim, particularly Christians, primarily in Lebanon, but also in South Sudan. And also you're looking, and this is perhaps more important, elements who are Arab and Muslim, but not radical. And the real question, the real challenge for Israel is to find local elements to cooperate with against the radicals in the region. So what you are looking for is somebody who has the same interest, very often an existential interest on the other side, against the radical elements. We have had something that changed recently, because for a very long time, the idea was that Israel is strong on the international level, and local elements in the region want to use the fact that Israel has an impact on the global scene. And this starts from the myth of Jewish power in the world. Part of it is anti-Semitic, and I'm for encouragement of anti-Semitism, namely if people believe that we are really as strong as we really control the world, it's a good idea to cooperate with us. And for a long time, we had cooperation with local elements in the Middle East because they believed that we can have an impact globally. In times when we had very good relations with the United States, this was true to some extent, but remember that until the late 60s, we didn't have very close relations with the United States, and recently, if you look at American policies, what Professor Lieber told us, and Israel, it's not exactly Israel that you want to use as a door in order to have influence in Washington. But for a very long time, this was the idea. But recently, it is a recognition in the region that Israel is a strong, advanced, determined country in the region that has problems, and sometimes very serious problems, on the international level. The elements in the Middle East that we cooperated with over the years were many and varied. Starting with Faisal-Weizmann agreement in the beginning of the Zionist endeavor, going over to the very important, and I will come back to it in a moment, relations with Jordan, relations with Morocco, Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Christians, as I mentioned, in Lebanon, in South Sudan, Kurds, today, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries, and countries who are not part of the Middle East, but are in the region in a broader sense. I'm speaking about Cyprus and Greece and Azerbaijan. So we've had these relations very often. They were clandestine, very often countries that in the open were unfriendly, even hostile to Israel. Behind the scene, we had very close relationship. I think the rule that you can apply to almost all of these relationships is that we were against the most important radical force in the area, and the countries or elements that I've mentioned have also been threatened by the same radicalism. I'll give at least two examples, speaking of Nasser's Egypt, speaking of Iran today, two countries who wanted to have regional hegemony. We were one of their targets. Others were afraid that they will impact them directly and also through their domestic structure. This was always true. When it comes to the relationship with the United States and other powers, it was mostly when the powers, particularly the United States, misunderstood the Middle East and did the wrong thing, and local powers had Israel as another element in the region who fears that the United States is making a mistake, and sometimes working with the United States when the Americans had a more realistic approach to the Middle East and trying to preserve the elements in the Middle East that were anti-radical at the time. Let me focus and give very shortly 4 examples. The struggles against the Palestinian radicalism at the end of the 1940s, the struggle against the Nasserite attempts at regional hegemony in the 50s and 60s, the attempt to change the regional rules of the game in the period of Jimmy Carter at the beginning of the 1970s, and the end of the 1970s, and the struggle that we are having now vis-a-vis Islamic radicalism, Sunni and Shia, and the attempts of Iran to establish its hegemony in the Middle East. Let's take the 1940s. There is a very deep strategic partnership between Israel and Jordan, or let me be more specific, between the Hashemite regime in Amman and Ben-Gurion, who's conducting these relations from the side of Israel, not always letting other elements in Israel know exactly what he is doing. And what we've had at the time had an enormous impact, because it is doubtful if Israel would have survived in the early months of its independence, speaking about the end of 1947 until the first truce in 1948, were it not for the fact that Jordan and Israel were actually not at war, but had the same interest, namely partitioning the land west of the River Jordan, the Jordanians taking over what was designed to be a Palestinian state, and Israel and Jordan having some kind of coexistence that both sides will live in. It made it possible for Israel not only to survive the first few months, but also to concentrate all its forces in the Negev, defeat the Egyptians, get them out of the war, and by that practically ending the war, by taking out the most important Arab army from the Arab coalition. And at the end of the war, this is what prevented Israel from taking over what came to be known later as the West Bank, in spite of the fact that in 2 days of fighting, this could have been done in 1949 after Egypt left the war. So you have a partnership with the Jordanians with an enormous impact on, of course, Israel and Jordan, but also, if you look at the implications later, on the region as a whole. Look at the 1950s and 60s, the struggle against the Egyptian hegemony of the region, the radical Egyptian hegemony on the region. The fact that we could cooperate with countries in the periphery, and this is what it was called, the Alliance of the Periphery, Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia, strengthened the Israeli position and made it possible later, when Eisenhower came back to his senses after the big mistake of 1956, and with the Eisenhower Doctrine saved the Western states, the pro-Western regimes that still remained in Jordan, in Lebanon. Jordan would not have been saved in 1957, certainly not in 1970, were it not for this alliance. It also helped Israel deal with the very counterproductive policy that the United States had in 1956, when the United States basically made Nasser the hegemon by its attitude vis-à-vis the British and the French operation. And it made it possible at the end of this period to push Nasser into the defensive and finally get rid of Nasser's hegemony in the region, when not only when Nasser died, but also when Egyptians understood that what Nasserism brought to Egypt was nothing short of a calamity. The third also has to do with America, Israel, and Egypt. What we have here is a cooperation between Israel and Egypt against the policy of an American president. When Jimmy Carter came to power, his notion was that one step at a time, the step-by-step policy by Henry Kissinger was counterproductive. You must look at a broader picture. He wanted a comprehensive approach to bring together all the countries in the Middle East, including Syria, including the PLO, bring in the Soviet Union, and he will bring peace everlasting to the whole region. This completely unrealistic idea threatened Sadat so much that he ran straight into the arms of Menachem Begin, because he understood that if he can come to American public opinion and say, I am presenting the option of an Israeli-Egyptian peace, then the hallucinations of Carter about a regional peace will be completely forgotten and everybody will focus on what really matters. And this changed not only Israel and Egypt, but the whole region, because the very fact that you take out Egypt from the equation puts all the potential of Israel vis-à-vis the rest of the Arab states, the radical Arab states, and therefore makes it impossible to come up with another major war, because Egypt is not a part of it. So the last major war that we've had in the Middle East is latest Israeli-Arab war was 1967, because after that a coalition was not possible, because Egypt was not there and Israel was strong enough vis-à-vis all the others to make it unreasonable for them to start it. It also changed Israel in a very fundamental way, including on the economic level. We went down from 23% of GNP devoted to defense to 6% of GNP devoting to defense. This is a huge difference that changed the Israeli society, that changed the Israeli hegemony, and, that changed the Israeli economy. And the American hegemony for the next decades was to a very large extent a product of what Sadat did against the will of an American president. Last but not least, what we are in today. We have today an identity of interests between Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, some countries in the Gulf, Jordan, Morocco, on a number of crucial subjects. Not on everything, but a number of crucial subjects. A, the perception that Iran is the enemy. B, that you don't want in the region not only a radical outside threat, but also a radical threat from the inside, namely the Muslim Brothers. So what Israel stands together with most of the countries that I have mentioned here is not only vis-à-vis Iran, but also vis-à-vis the Muslim Brothers, and to some extent, because it's the Muslim Brothers, also vis-à-vis Turkey, vis-à-vis the elements of Turkey that can encourage Muslim Brothers, for instance, in Egypt or in Jordan, if that is the case. And you have here an Israeli support for those Arabs who want to fight against the Shiite radicalism, also the Sunni radicalism, namely the Muslim Brothers, and also, that's the second point, and I think this is very important, but most of it has already been discussed by Professor Liebe here, also the very deep concern of these countries and Israel vis-à-vis the American retrenchment and American retreat, and the incompetence of the policy that we've seen from Washington, not only by the Obama administration, we also had some very major problems in the Bush administration, but primarily in the Obama administration. Because if you look at the region from an Arab point of view, what you see is an Arab world that is losing, and to some extent I would even say hopeless. The United States in a position where the enemies of the United States are being emboldened and the supporters of the United States are being undercut. And on the other hand, you see Iran becoming more significant in the region. The way it negotiated with the United States and the P5+1 demonstrated that Iran can play in the league of powers. The impact in the region, namely not only if Iran will get a nuclear weapon or not, but what does it mean that Iran can proceed, even if not immediately, towards nuclear weapons and negotiate as equal, or not as equal, but as the member of the same league with the most important powers in the world. This threatens the regimes in the region, and what they find in Israel is a country that is dedicated to fighting against what they're afraid of, both their domestic enemies and their foreign enemies. Let me say, in conclusion, what this kind of understanding and partnership can produce and what it cannot produce. It cannot produce any kind of open alliance, because the cost of working with Israel outweighs dramatically most of the benefits that they cannot get without coming out in the open. Most of the benefits they can get when they are not out in the open. So even the Egyptians, who don't try very hard to conceal that they're in good relations with Israel, even in Egypt it has a limit. And in Saudi Arabia, they're not even encouraged to start bringing it out in the open, because the benefits will be minute and the costs will be very high. What you can do is prepare for a long period. It will take, even if you have a different American president now who knows what he's doing in the Middle East, and I doubt if this will be the case regardless of who will be elected, even if this is happening, it takes time to reverse the Obama effect in the region, and you need to prepare for a long period of hardship. Last but not least, it is only Israel and some other countries in the region, but the impact on the region was not small. You have both today a situation where the existence of Israel, were it not for the alliance with Jordan, I'm not sure if Israel could have been what it is today. Of course, Jordan would not have existed. I would say a very high chance that Jordan would not have existed were it not for the Israeli intervention and the threat of Israeli intervention time and again, and I think that another opportunity may arise. Israel played a major role in getting rid of the Nasserite threat to the whole region, and it has some part in helping establish the American hegemony in the region. So where it's only one country, the impact on the region was quite considerate. Let me now turn to the other speakers in our panel. The first is Major General Yaakov Amidror. I had the privilege of knowing Amidror from the time that he worked in Israeli intelligence, in the assessment of Israeli intelligence, later as the commander of all military colleges, and later as the national security advisor of Israel. And I'm delighted to invite Yaakov, who knows what he's speaking about, to come here and speak about what he knows about, or not speak about what he knows about, after I spoke about what I don't know about. Yaakov.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here, and to speak after Dan. It's very interesting because the challenge is that you have to be more provocative than him, and it's almost impossible. The truth is that my relations with Saudi Arabia begins towards the end of the 70s. I was nominated to be the head of the branch responsible for Saudi Arabia in military intelligence in 77 or 78. And I remember myself coming for the briefing in the Mossad with the lady which was responsible for the Saudi Arabia. Her name was Sarah. And she gave me full 3 days about Saudi Arabia. And at the end, she said, General, I was colonel then, Colonel, but remember, Saudi Arabia, as it is, cannot survive the end of the 20th century. I mean, it's cannot consist with the situation in the world and the modern life and so on and so forth. She's not there, I'm not there. I don't know how many people which became responsible for Saudi Arabia after her are not there, and Saudi Arabia is still the same Saudi Arabia. When I was in the job one night, I was called and I was told that the group of extreme Muslims are controlling now the Kaaba, and the Saudis don't know what to do. At the end of the day, they brought special forces from France to help them. I asked very prominent Saudi guy a few years later why they didn't bring the Americans, and they said, from America everything is linking and we wanted something that will be in silent. So they brought special forces from France and they did the job. The Saudis say that the Saudis did the job, but the truth is they did the job together. But I remember the meeting in the morning with the head of the intelligence. I'm the one who was responsible for Saudi Arabia, saying Saudi Arabia from now on will not be the same Saudi Arabia. And it is. So we have to be very modest when we speak about Saudi Arabia, because we really don't understand how things and what is the mechanism, what might change it and what might not change it, because from all we know, it's very at the outside and not within the inner circles who are making the decisions, within the family. What are the real forces within the family? What we understood, that it's a very rich country with very weak tools to implement, even if they decide to implement. Since then, since I was the head of the Saudi branch many years ago, I was very young then, and I'm not very young now anymore. I think that the main 4 issues is that the United States of America is in a retreat from the Middle East, and with all due respect, you don't count bases to show that you are not retreating. Depends on what you do. And depends on what you do, and what you do, you are retreating. I don't blame you, it's a fact, but America is retreating from the Middle East. It's not out of the Middle East, but it is retreating. There is the agreement with the Iranians. There is the problems with the oil prices, and the issue of succession in Saudi Arabia that 30 years ago was not there, and today it's a huge problem. How to move from the present generation to the next one. The generations of the sons to the generations of the grandsons. How you deal with the so many cousins in the line. The retreat of the United States of America and the agreement with Iran, which are very much connected, of course, expose the, how to call it, the isolation of Saudi Arabia and its allies. They lost the anchor that they had for so many years. And they are watching growing enemy on the other side, an enemy from the religious point of view, Shiites versus Sunnis, Arabs versus Iranians, and historical enemy with all the old relations between the two countries and two group of Muslims. The result of both the agreement with the Iranians and the retreat of the Middle East is a kind of a trauma. And you cannot understand Saudi Arabia attitude and behavior today without understanding that in a way, the new situation puts Saudi Arabia in a trauma. And they have to react to this trauma and to see, okay, what can be done? When it came with the prices of the oil, which put them within an economic problem, when they understand that there are limitations to their ability to buy and to purchase and to continue with the same system, it's made them very, very concerned about their future. If these prices of oil had been occurred 20 years ago, and America is very strong around it, around the Middle East, and Iran is in the corner, much easier to deal with. But all the three together put the Saudis in a situation in which they have to change their attitude towards the Middle East and the situation. In the meantime, there is a new generation in Saudi Arabia which is more confident, better educated, which grow up in a very rich monarchy. He knows the world, and he believes that he understands how to act within this world, something that the old generation had to learn by the job. And in a way, they are more fit to deal with the problems than the older generation, even if the generation of the old cousins. And the new generation is very impressive, if I may say. They understood that the main difference between the ability of the Shiites, which is the dynamic force in the Middle East today, and the Sunnis, which are reacting all the time, is the fact that the Shiites are united and they have a leader. And within the Sunnis, what you see is a huge fragmentation, no natural leader. If you want understanding, see the number of the rebels groups in Syria. This is the best way to see the fragmentation. Every settlement, every area has its own organization. Told them once, 4 years, 5 years, it's not a secret anymore. 5 years ago, we tried to understand how many groups are acting around Idlib, and we found 42 different groups of rebels. But it's true about the whole Sunni world. There is no Iran in the Sunni world. In the past, people thought that maybe Egypt is the natural leader of the Sunnis in the Middle East, but not anymore. It's still the biggest Sunni state. It still has Al-Azhar. But with all the problems that Egypt is facing, it cannot be the natural leader of the Arab Sunnis in the Middle East. And what the Saudis try to do is to take the burden upon themselves, and they learn that it is not easy. There is even disagreement within themselves. What does it mean and how should it be done? Because it's not easy to build a new track that you don't have any experience with in the past. They understood that by themselves they cannot do it. They need the other Gulf countries, and the Emirates are very important in this path. They need Egypt, and this is why they are ready to give Egypt the economic aid. Still, Egypt is the biggest Sunni country, and with the real big army, which the Saudis do not have. They have some successes. For example, they succeeded to buy out Sudan from the hands of the Iranians. Huge success, very important because of the location of Sudan. But at the end of the day, the Saudis understand they cannot do it by themselves. And here there is the little dream and the big dream. The little dream is to build an alliance between Egypt, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia is the leader, in the center, Jordan, maybe the Sunni countries, I don't like to call them moderate, those who seek for status quo in the situation, and not to lose the situation for the Iranians, either in Syria, Iraq, tomorrow morning in Lebanon, and so on. And there is the big dream. In the big dream, Israel is a very important factor. As was said by Prince Turkey when I met him in Washington, he said with the Israeli money and the Arab mind, we can change the Middle East. I'm quoting. You can go to the Washington Institute website and see that what had been said by Prince Turkey. And I really believe that the combination between our capabilities and the Saudis, Emirates, Egyptian, and Jordanian capabilities, we can build another Middle East to stabilize it, to put barriers in front of the Iranians, to stop the success of ISIS, and even to eliminate it at the end. But for them, this change that they really want to happen is very much depend on an agreement between us and the Palestinians. And they say it clearly without any question. If you want real alliance, not just under the table, in which it's understood that there are many connections, but if you want something real on the table, which will have a strong basis to work together, you have to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. They say it and they mean it. What is the problem? The problem is that it didn't work in the last 40 years. And if you are in a private business and you try to sell something for 40 years and you don't succeed, you know that you have to get rid of the head of your marketing and sales, and to find another way to do it. And I really believe that if the key for the changes in the Middle East will be in the hands of the Palestinians, it will not happen. More than that, the more that they insist that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will be solved before something will happen between us and those Arab countries, the more the price that the Palestinians will ask for the agreement, and less readiness to compromise. Because if the key for changing of the Middle East in their hands, they should get much better agreement. Much better agreement in the eyes of the Palestinians means less chances that Israel will agree to such an agreement. And the only way to change this unbelievable circle that they really want another Middle East, and we are ready to cooperate, is to go the other direction. And this is one of the biggest mistakes of the Europeans and the Americans. They are not ready to put pressure on the Palestinians. All the pressure is on us, and they will not get anything. Why? Because the more the pressure on us, the higher the price that the Palestinians want. And their readiness to compromise is less and less. And I can tell it from first hand because I was the head of the assessment branch a year before Oslo. So I know all the details from before Oslo till today. You can ask me about every idea which emerged within the Palestinians. I can tell you where is the source, who was against, who was pro, and what happened to these ideas. And my conclusion is that the only way to build another Middle East with these Sunni countries is to go the other way, is to build something between us and those countries. Alliance is a strong word. I mean, an umbrella which will be shared by the Saudis, the Israelis, the Emirates, and Egypt and Jordan, which are the easier partners, because they have diplomatic relations with us. And to tell the Palestinians, if you don't come in for negotiations, you will lose your place under this umbrella. The stronger the umbrella, the more pressure will be on the Palestinians to come in. And only if there will be such an umbrella with the support of the United States of America and the Europeans, the chances to bring here the Palestinians will become higher. Otherwise, if that will stay in the hands of the Palestinians, it will never happen. The Palestinians may have many reasons not to negotiate. One of them, they don't have to negotiate. They can reach all the benefits from the United Nations vote, the European initiative of international conference, whatever. Geneva, they will get around the world everything that they want. By the way, with the majority that they have today in the General Assembly of the United Nations, they can bring tomorrow morning a decision that the sun is shining in Israel in the West, and they will have the majority. So why should they compromise? No one is demanding them in the international arena to compromise. Why should they go back to the negotiation table and there they have to compromise? I'm not speaking about reaching an agreement. This is another issue. Can we reach an agreement? It's another discussion. Can we reach a situation in which we are negotiating? The blame for not having any negotiation now is in the shoulder of the Americans and the Europeans, which give the Palestinian the impression that both America and Europe is in their side, so why should they negotiate? And the only way to change it and to begin the first step towards different Middle East, in which Saudi Arabia will be a cornerstone, and they understand that they need it because of what I said at the beginning, is to force the Palestinians to come in by having frame of cooperation within those Arab states, and Saudi, of course, is one of them, with the support of United States of America and the European. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yaakov. Let me now invite Professor Meir Litvak from Tel Aviv University. Meir is a scholar both concerning the Arab world and Iran, so he can give us a broad picture, but I understand you'll speak about Iran and Saudi Arabia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In a recent article aimed at the US public, former Iranian diplomat Said Hossein Mousavian argued that Saudi Arabia had replaced the US and Israel as the biggest security threat for Iran. Indeed, it is safe to say that the strategic rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia has escalated in the past 5 years of the Arab upheaval into an open war by proxies. Scholarship on this rivalry follows three broad approaches. The first is the power politics approach, which has focused on the balance of power between the two states. The second focuses on religious and ideological differences that were exacerbated in the aftermath of the Iran Revolution. And the third approach focuses on the role of personalities and institutions within each country. The power politics approach emphasizes the power dynamics of competing Saudi and Iranian interests, arguing that the relations are destined to rivalry as each side aspires to enforce its hegemonic influence in the region, particularly in the Gulf. Even issues such as sectarianism and nationalism are assumed to be political forces employed to win hegemonic competition or at least constrain the rivals' regional role. This approach points to the rivalry that dates the rivalry back to the 1970s, following Britain's withdrawal from the Persian Gulf, and argues that the competition was constrained because of the Cold War, whereas the Iran Revolution removed this barrier. The power politics approach located three major causes of tension between the two countries. First was the competition over the regional order, as Iran sees itself as the natural power in the Gulf in view of its size, population, and historical legacy, while Saudi Arabia regards itself as the natural leader of the Arab side of the Gulf. Iranian vehement opposition to U.S. military presence in the region and the perceived threat of Saudi-U.S. alliance to Iranian security have added to this tension. Second are the disputes over maritime and territorial borders. And third, economic competition, mainly over oil prices and frequent fights over control of OPEC. Iran, because of its larger population and needs, especially needs of reconstruction after the war against Iraq, always sought higher oil prices regardless of the impact on the long-term development of the global energy market. Saudis could afford lower oil prices for a longer time. And another element, of course, is the arms race between the two nations. Here, by the way, I'm citing Greg Gross' article. Significantly, there is a high measure of continuity between the Islamic Republic rhetoric and actions to that of the Pahlavis before them. The political ideological approach points to the two competing models of government of Iran and Saudi Arabia, each laying claim to Islamic legitimacy, and two very different visions of regional order. The Iranian system abhors monarchical rule as inherently un-Islamic and has enshrined the leadership of the religious authorities, the clergy, in political life. Although Iran is a dictatorship, it has given the people some say in government through elections, and Iran has trumpeted an explicitly populist line. All characteristics have been directly opposite to the Saudi monarchical system and domestic policy. Indeed, during the first years after the revolution, Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, consistently called to topple the monarchies in the Gulf. Moreover, both countries claim the mantle of leadership of the Muslim world. The official title of Iran's supreme leader in the constitution is Wali Amr al-Muslimin, that is the supreme leader of all the Muslim world. In addition, in 1984, for instance, Khomeini challenged a crucial pillar of Saudi legitimacy and claim for Islamic leadership by calling for shared Islamic sovereignty over the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. In later years, Iran slandered or attacked Saudi Arabia as Saudi Islam, as an American Islam. Some Western scholars downplay the role of sectarian animosity, but I believe that this is what makes this rivalry so bitter and acrimonious. Shias and Wahhabis stand on many issues on the two extremes of the Islamic spectrum. The Wahhabis have always regarded the Shias as apostates because of their adulation of the 12 Imams and visitations of graves, Ziyarat al-Qubur. They have not only spoken against the Shias, but also massacred thousands of Shias in Karbala in 1801, an event that is still alive in Shia Iranian memory. And later they persecuted the Shia minority in eastern Saudi Arabia. I would also assume that the Wahhabi Salafi claim that Shias are worse than Jews is particularly annoying for many Iranians. The Iranians have always sought to downplay the overt sectarian issue because of their minority status in the region and the realization that hate and sectarianism would destroy their chances of gaining Islamic leadership. Therefore, they sought to reach out for Sunni organizations, most importantly Palestinian Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They highlighted their support of the Palestinian struggle and castigated the Saudis for their inaction on the Palestinian issue. Still, in Iraq and Lebanon, for example, Iranian policy had a clear sectarian slant, which was evident to the Saudis and other adversaries. While Shias do not define their opponents as apostates, they nevertheless developed an ever-growing polemical literature against the Wahhabis. In addition, various Iranian statements reflect Iranian ethnocentrism or the tension between what I would call refined urban civilization on the Iranian side vis-à-vis the predominant tribal culture on the Saudi side. In 1971, for example, Khomeini, then in exile, lashed at the Saudis as, here I quote, the followers of the camel grazers of Riyadh and the barbarians of the Najd, and the most infamous and wildest members of the human family. The annual Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca provided another highly sensitive and symbolic arena for Tehran to annoy or rattle the Saudis by inciting Iranian pilgrims toward revolutionary activism and rhetoric. Inciting all pilgrims. Recurring tensions reached their peak in 1987 when over 450 Iranian pilgrims were killed by the Saudi security forces. In response, Iran severed its diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, and Khomeini vowed that even if it was possible to forgive Saddam Hussein, now this is during the Iran-Iraq War, it would not be possible to forgive Saudi Arabia. As for the role of personalities and factions, it became more evident after Khomeini's death, when then President Rafsanjani and subsequently President Khatami sought to ameliorate relations with neighboring Arab countries, especially the Saudis. Conversely, clerics who did not hold official positions in the Iranian state continued to express hostile attitudes toward the Saudis. Following the signing of the Iranian nuclear agreement, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards seemed to highlight the Saudi card in order to undermine Rouhani's overall policies. The fall of the Saddam Hussein regime following the 2003 American invasion to Iraq and the shift of power from the Sunni minority to the Shia majority boosted Iran's position vis-à-vis the Saudis. Iran took advantage of this shift in order to form the so-called axis of resistance against to US and Israeli hegemony, which also included Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Palestinian Hamas, which has served its effort to reach regional hegemony. In addition, starting from 2009, Iran extended material support to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, thereby posing an additional challenge to the Saudis from the south. The formation of this axis demonstrated Iran's greater skill than the Saudis in using proxies to advance its strategic goals. Iran has also rattled Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries through its strategy of speaking directly over the heads of Arab rulers to their publics, undermining the rulers' legitimacy by portraying them as lackeys of the US and, again, upstaging them on the Palestinian question. Indeed, the resistance axis proved for a while to be more effective than the Saudi-led pro-settlement axis, as it was more cohesive and more proactive. More importantly, for a while, following Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000 and the 2006 Israel-Lebanese war, it appeared to be more successful in advancing Arab-Muslim goals. The outbreak of the Arab upheaval in 2011 brought Iran and Saudi rivalry to new heights. Iran, unlike the Saudis, welcomed the popular revolts that toppled secular pro-Western regimes. Moreover, Iranian leaders claimed that their 1979 revolution had been the major source of inspiration for the Arab revolts, and they expressed their confidence regarding the emergence of a new Islamic Middle Eastern order in which Iran would play the central role. As protests flared in Bahrain and Yemen, Iranian anger turned directly against Saudi Arabia, and the Iranian media expressed the hope that the riots in these countries would spread to Kuwait and to Saudi Arabia itself. When the Saudis sent their troops to Bahrain to quell the protests, Iranian reactions reflected a certain division of labor among the various Iranian factors. Iranian defense minister at the time, Vahidi, warned the Saudis from the serious repercussions of their actions to regional stability, and charged with some self-righteousness that the role of governments is to protect the independence of their people, not to attack them or kill them. The Iranian media took a harsher position and warned Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia should expect a tsunami in its territory. Radical members of parliament warned that the continued massacre in Bahrain would lead to the downfall of the Saudi royal family. Yet, Iran recoiled from direct confrontation And when the Saudis and an Iranian flotilla that was supposed to sent to Bahrain, similar to the Turkish flotilla in Gaza, withdrew once the Saudis sent their ships. At the same time, Iran did not hide its satisfaction over the Houthi capture of Sana'a in September 2014, which the Saudis saw as a direct challenge from the south. Radical member of parliament Zakani, again who represents the hardliners in Tehran, boasted that Iran now controlled 4 Arab capitals: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and now Sana'a. Ali Akbar Vilayati, the senior foreign policy advisor of Supreme Leader Khamenei, expressed his confidence that the Houthis would play a similar role as one that Hezbollah plays in Lebanon. That is an important strategic instrument of Iranian policy, thereby, in my view, sending a clear message to the Saudis. He also highlighted potential Houthi control over the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. He said it for the struggle against Israel, but also I think the implications for the Saudis were quite clear. Syria became the major arena of the Saudis, of Iran and Saudi war by proxies, in which both countries stood at positions ironically opposite to the traditional role. Iran supporting the status quo represented by the Assad regime, and the Saudis supporting the forces calling for change. The dominant role of the Salafi jihadi organizations in the Syrian struggle exacerbated the sectarian factor in the strategic rivalry. However, while sectarianism undermined Iran's regional aspirations, it clearly enhanced its position vis-à-vis the Saudis in the international arena. Whereas Saudi Arabia cannot erase the problematic association between its official Wahhabi creed and regional Salafi ideology, Iran has emerged in Western eyes as the responsible, level-headed regional power that actually fights these crazy jihadists. More so, the nuclear agreement between Iran and the world powers further boosted Iran's position. Saudi failure to impact the agreement not only exposed its weakness vis-à-vis the new American priorities, but also created certain tension between, with the US to Iran's clear joy. The threat of ISIS and the nuclear agreement enhanced Iran's position in Syria and Iraq and its legitimate role in Western eyes in both countries. Iran's re-entry to the global oil market aggravated the economic competition with the Saudis, and while Saudi policy of driving oil prices down clearly hurts Iran, the cost for the Saudis was not negligible either. Moreover, since the signing of the agreement, hundreds of Western business executives came to Tehran to advance investments and joint business deals with Iran. And while the actual fruits of this process are yet to come, many in the Western business community see Iran as the more promising economic hub in the region that would eclipse Saudi Arabia thanks to its more advanced human and technological potential and the size of its domestic market. Alongside these developments, several events demonstrate the ferocity of the sectarian issue and the importance of the factional factor in UN politics. Since his election in 2013, Rouhani has emphasized the need to improve Iran's relations with its Arab neighbors, while the hardliners use the sectarianism to undermine his domestic policy and efforts of reconciliation. The first such example was the alleged sexual harassment of 2 young Saudi pilgrims in the Jeddah airport in May 2015, which produced hard reactions by Iranian clerics and media against the Saudis. Maybe more important was the wave of reactions in the Iranian social media against the Saudis and Arabs in general, including the use of pejoratives against Arabs as unclean dogs, lizard eaters, dirty Arabs, and remaining Iranians that the Arabs had raped Iran 1400 years ago. Iran used the tragic death of over 460 Iranian pilgrims in the stampede during the Hajj ceremonies in September 2015 to challenge Saudi religious credentials by calling for broader Islamic management of the Hajj and demanded that an Islamic probe into the affair. The Saudi execution of the Shi'i Sheikh Nimr Bakr al-Nimr on January 2nd this year elicited harsh Iranian responses predicting the end of the corrupt and oppressive Saudi dynasty. Khamenei, for his part, threatened that that the execution would leave its mark, would leave its impacts, and the Saudi politicians will be punished by divine vengeance. Now, although ostensibly harsh, in my view, relegating the punishment to God was intended, apparently, to relieve Iran from the moral duty to do really actually something on the ground, to avenge Nimer's blood. On the popular level, Iranian mobs ransacked the Saudi diplomatic premises in Tehran and Mashhad. In response, Saudi Arabia severed its diplomatic relations with Iran and expelled Iranian diplomats from its territory. The attacks in Iran were probably instigated, or at least tolerated, by the hardliners in Iran who sought to put Rouhani in a bind. The hardline media denounced Rouhani's spineless policy vis-à-vis Saudi provocations, which supposedly encouraged Saudi defiance and intransigence and deepened popular hatred of Saudi Arabia in Iran. They concluded that had Rouhani acted more defiantly against the Saudis, the attacks in Iran would not have taken place. Throughout this period, the Iranian media waged a broad smear campaign against the Wahhabi school for its intolerance and bloody ideology, and against the Saudi royal family. And since I don't have too much time, I will just mention that among the harshest insults the Iranians have hurled against the Saudi royal family, was its Jewish origins from the Jewish tribe of Banu Kainuka that had fought the Prophet Muhammad. Thus, the Iranians linked the Saudis to another despised enemy and presented the Saudis as the enemies of Islam from its inception. And this enemy was defeated once and is destined, therefore, to be defeated again. Overall, Iran conveys increasing confidence of its superior position vis-à-vis the Saudis. Vilayati, for one, stated last February that Iran is the major local power in the region, and he mocked Saudi failures in Yemen and in Syria. These expressions reflect, in my view, the multifaceted nature of Iranian-Saudi rivalry, which combines strategic interest and deep ideological antipathy, and appears to prolong the conflict between the two countries for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must admit that I've never heard about lizard eaters before, so it really contributed something about my knowledge of the area. The last speaker in our session is John Jenkins, a British former diplomat who served as the UK ambassador in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Burma, and Saudi Arabia, and is now resident of Manama, Bahrain, as the director of the Middle East branch of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, one of the few among us who really knows the area from within, and therefore I'm sure the contribution will be particularly interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I've been told that I need to speak slowly. So I will try and fit everything in the 15 to 20 minutes that I have to say. And what I'm going to say is really a set of reflections on what I've heard over the last 2 days, which has been absolutely fascinating. I'm not going to summon somebody to... I should also say that I'm not Einstein, and I'm certainly not Mother Teresa. And having lived in the Middle East for something like 20 of the last 35 years, the only thing I think I've really learned is that the more you know about the Middle East, the less you know. So these are my reflections. And I'm going to start with some thoughts about the complexities of the situation in which we find ourselves at the moment. I say we, I'm talking about really the Sunni Middle East and the Gulf in particular. And the rather complex continuities and discontinuities that we see in the situation at the moment. And I'm going to start with Bahrain because that's where I live. And somebody yesterday, I think, said it was a protectorate of Saudi Arabia, which I'm not entirely sure about. But it's an interesting perception. I was reading this morning a blog by Abers Kazim, whom some of you may know, who is a scholar of these matters, I think still based in the United States. And he was reflecting on on the Bahraini decision to remove citizenship from Isa Qasim, the founder and major religious spiritual authority of Al-Wafaq, the opposition Shia movement, which has also just been banned. And he said he was comparing Isa Qasim, or the situation of Isa Qasim, to that of Ayatollah Khomeini when he was in exile in Iraq and then in France, and suggesting that the inevitable result of this action by the Bahraini government was going to be a similar sort of revolution to the one we saw in 1979 in Iran. And suggesting, actually, as I read him, that this would be a good thing. We've also seen recently public comments by Qasem Soleimani, whom you will all know, to the effect that all these actions by the Bahraini government justify an armed uprising against them. They have become illegitimate. When I was ambassador in Iraq in 2011, shortly after the first disturbances happened at the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain, I happened to be going to see the late Ahmed Chalabi. And he said to me, it was about 3 days later, he said, these things, it's outrageous what's happening in Bahrain. This is an affront to all Shia, to all of us, and I'm going to set up an organization for the defense of the Shia in Bahrain. A day later, there was a massive meeting held by the Supreme Council for the Revolution. Well, it wasn't called the Revolution, the Supreme Council for the Shia in Iraq under Ahmad Hakim, where similar sentiments were expressed. Because the connectivity across borders of these groups, the transnational networking that we see, not just with Shia, but with others, is very, very powerful. In 1971, when we finally withdrew from the Gulf and the states of the lower Gulf became independent, we sent a former British ambassador, Dennis Wright, who had been an ambassador in Tehran, and also been involved actually in the undignified scramble out of Aden and the South Arabian Federation in 1967, to do a deal with the Shah. And the deal was that the Shah would not interfere or seek to influence the referendum which we were planning with the UN in the plebiscite in Bahrain on its identity and whether it was going to become a state or an Iranian protectorate. In return, we would let the Shah take the 3 islands in the Gulf, the Abu Musa and the Tutums in the lower Gulf, which belonged to various emirates in what became the UAE. And the Shah said, I'll do that, and I'll save your blushes, I will march in 24 hours after you've left. Actually, he marched in 24 hours before, just to show that he could, which was an interesting reflection. Well, it says quite a lot about the Shah, and it says quite a lot about the way we behaved in the early 1970s. And if you think about 1979, the Iranian Revolution, which was proclaimed as an Islamic revolution. This is for all the oppressed, particularly the Muslim oppressed, but for all oppressed, and it was an Islamic revolution for everybody. But what happened, when you look at what happened in Kuwait, the riots, the disturbances that happened in Kuwait, in Bahrain, the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, the attempted coup in Bahrain in the early 1980s, a lot of them stimulated by the Office for the Liberation Movements set up under Mehdi Hashemi in Tehran, and driven through the Shirazi, Madarrisi networks, which had arisen some time before and were being used and instrumentalized by the Iranians. You see a very powerful sectarian dimension to this, even though this was something I think that the Iranian government, particularly Iranian revolutionary activists, tried to avoid. But what does this tell us when you look at this whole span of history, this 10 to 15-year period? I mean, Iran remains an abiding concern in the Gulf. Under the Shah, the threat was more physical than it was ideological. Having grand and ludicrous celebrations of Persepolis and quoting Cyrus and Darius, and Khosrau and the Sassanians and the Parthians doesn't really mobilize opinion in the Arab Muslim Middle East. Appealing to the Imams does. And I think that is a powerful distinction because this leads to different responses, which is what we're seeing now. Let me move on to the Emirates briefly, because the Emirates is one model of how you deal with these complexities and these challenges. The Emirati model And the first place I ever worked in the Middle East as a diplomat was Abu Dhabi in 1983, a long, long time ago, when Dubai didn't really have any towers. But the Emirati model is essentially a deep security state, financed by massive energy revenues and an entrepot model in Dubai, underlying a lifestyle liberal superstructure that offers enough to everyone to make it not a sea urchin, as Singapore is, but the land of the sirens or the lotus eaters. It's an interesting approach to national security, that this is a place where everybody can get what they want. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, at the moment, people talk about Saudi Arabia a lot. For me, and I'd lived there for 3 years, the challenges they see in the region at the moment are stimulating two emotions. One is exhilaration, the sense fueled by this overwhelmingly young population that this is a challenge they want to meet. And they love the fact that it's Mohammed bin Salman who's in charge. He's young. He doesn't look like their grandfather. He looks like one of them. He behaves like one of them. He wants to go and beat up the Shia, push back the Iranians in Yemen. But on the other hand, there's profound anxiety about the future, about where this is leading. I think that's not a particularly stable mixture. If you look at Oman and Qatar, who are both in some ways, in different ways, mavericks within the GCC, they also have different ways of responding to this. Qatar has tried to buy its way to influence in the Middle East, which has failed. And Oman, interestingly, has tried to maintain a system of alliances, of relationships, of friendships that no one else in the Gulf has. But Oman is always slightly isolated, which has meant that Oman within the GCC is at a slight angle to most other states, in a different way to Qatar. And these ideational threats, which are, in my view, as profound as the physical security threats that the GCC face from the massive stocks of ballistic missiles, for example, that Iran has, have been reflected in different approaches to things like political Islamisms. And I say Islamisms because there are all sorts of different varieties of political Islamisms. You look at the way that Qatar has behaved. You look at the way that the Saudis behaved from 2011 to 2014 in Saudi over Egypt, and the way that they have reframed that approach in Yemen, where they clearly need the support of certain political Islamists, notably those associated with al-Islah. We see it reflected in different approaches to Iran, even within the United Arab Emirates. And the UAE, remember the UAE itself, which is, whatever it is, 35 years old, 45 years old, still has certain tensions between some of its component parts. There is clearly distinction between the Benias, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and the Qawasim North, the Qawasim Hanbali North. And contrary to what somebody claimed this morning, UAE is not a Wahhabi state. Actually, the UAE, by and large, is a Maliki state, with some Shafi'i and a Hanbali mixture in the north. But what we're seeing, or what we don't see in all of this, I think, is a real shared understanding of what these threats are, what they mean for the individual countries, and how you deal with them. You look at coordination, military coordination, for example. People have been talking about command and control, unified command and control over the air, over the maritime, over the land space for decades. This goes back to the foundation of the GCC. People are talking about combined control of missile defenses, which are being upgraded as we speak. This hasn't happened. There's something called, there's a proposal for a Gulf Currency Union. There's a big headquarters in Riyadh you can go to. It's a very nice building. But none of this is happening. The structures of the states, as we look at them, remain in many ways personal and patrimonial. But this is not because Arabs are unsophisticated or incompetent. This has happened because of the ways in which these states have been structured to reflect underlying interests, differences, particular sociologies, and mutual suspicions. And the challenge ahead for all of them, collectively, it seems to me, is this. And I think many of them recognize this, is how to develop new, more broadly based models of legitimacy and procure national and perhaps collective security in an age of unprecedented ideological upheaval, transnational threats, and inter- and intrastate conflict. And I say this is unprecedented. It's an interesting question whether it is unprecedented. I think it is, because I think the new element in all of this over the last 10 years has been God. So how far will this upheaval and the challenge of reform, internal reform, we were talking about the possibilities of economic reform this morning. We've talked about reforming the social contract and so forth. How far will all this privilege security over economics or politics? Or to rephrase the question, can you walk and chew cart at the same time? I say cart, of course it's Yemen is where they chew cart, but it's a cheap joke, I know, I apologise. And that raises the question of what politics means in the GCC. There has been politics in the Gulf. People forget this. You go back to the 1930s, there was a democracy movement in many of these states. Actually, the democracy movement came off the back of the Palestinian revolt, the Zedin Qassam revolt from 36 to 38, which became a mobilizing and consolidating factor. The 1950s, labor unrest in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Actually, what we saw in the 1930s and the 1950s was Shia and Sunni working together on common social issues. This was politics. We saw this in the 1970s with the formation of the UAE, after the formation of the UAE, with the intense debates about what this meant in terms of how the Emirates acted together. One thing has happened, I think, over the last 30 years is much of this, well, two things happened. One is a lot of real politics went underground, and it became, in many ways, framed in a religious manner. We saw this in Saudi Arabia, particularly with what's called the Sahwa. But the Sahwa was a Gulf-wide phenomenon. It wasn't simply Saudi. And now you look at the way that politics is framed in the region. It is constructed around a reimagined tribalism, a performative expression of loyalty, theatrical expressions of these sort of things, but also a contest for authority within religion, a focus on youth in quite a restricted way, but also this issue of material reward. What do you get for agreeing to this way of doing politics, as it were? None of this is static. People talk about tribes. Tribes are not static things. Tribes change all the time. But what we've seen is a narrowing down of the space within which you can do all this. And this tells us, I think, that politics, in the sense of political mobilization, often in the hands of adversarial, sectarian, communal, or single-issue entrepreneurs, like Chalabi, remains extremely powerful. And this space, at least, remains open, but in deeply problematic ways. We see this with the constructed cleavages between Sunni and Shia. People will say before 79, we had no idea who was Sunni and Shia in Bahrain. Complete nonsense, everybody knew. But it wasn't politicized, it wasn't mobilized in the same way before 79 as it is now. We see it with politically mobilized forms of dissident Salafism that cause the evolving Saudi Hanbali Salafi state, and I say that because they do not call themselves Wahhabis. Abdulaziz in 1929 forbade the term Wahhabi, because this relates to an individual in 18th century Arabia. He said we are Salafis, which itself is a problematic term, but less problematic, and Hanbali. But we see this with this dissident, forms of dissident Salafisms. And we see it with the issue of Palestine, which General Amidror talked about. And this isn't because the Gulf Arabs see Palestine or the Palestinian issue as their main challenge. It's not. The main challenge for them is Iran. They will say this. But it's a major ideological dividing line that others can and will exploit in an age where these differences have considerable political traction. And maybe security is the only thing that matters, in which case an open political relationship doesn't matter. It didn't in the 1960s when Saudi Arabia, the UK, France and Israel were working together, semi-clandestinely, with the royalist rebels in Yemen. The Israelis were doing the airdrops. We provided territorial special forces, and the royalists did a lot of the shooting. And the Saudis paid for it all. And now you can see a new commonality of action against Hezbollah, for example, which is one of the reasons, I think, that Bahrainis are acting in the way they are against Ali Salman and Issa Qasim. It's part of the same thing, whatever you think of it. But if a political relationship does matter, or if politics does matter, for Saudi Arabia, Iran and Israel, the thing that puts the tool of ideological mobilization in the hands of others And that can mean a dangerously dissident rethinking of the foundational compact at the heart of the reimagined classic Sunni state that is Saudi Arabia. If you look at the writings of Salman al-Awda, for example, Sheikh Salman al-Awda, his book, Masail al-Thawra, Questions of Revolution, look like a Salafi reimagining of John Locke from time to time. Sectarian support, if such a thing is possible, sectarian support for Shia insurgent and revolutionary groups, and Palestine. And Palestine focused on Jerusalem in particular, because that seems to be the religious hinge of this. This needs to be tackled. And I'm not saying how all of this stuff needs to be tackled. I just say that's what I think needs to happen. So this is a time of real turbulence centered on the Gulf and the Levant. It'll change the GCC, but it won't break it. If you consider times of crisis in the GCC in the different countries, 60 to 64, the crisis between Saud and Faisal, 1971, the British withdrawal from the Gulf, the Iranian threat, 1975, the assassination of Faisal, 80 to 88, the Iran-Iraq war, 1991, the invasion of Kuwait, 2003 to 2005, the failed insurgency in Saudi Arabia. They've dealt with these things before. They have come through times of trouble. They've dealt with fiscal implosion under Saud. They've dealt with low oil prices from a position of far less fiscal resilience than now. And there is resilience in these systems. The economic challenges are massive, I do not deny that, and they're new in many ways, but the Gulf can be unexpectedly adaptive. Just 3 minutes. So whatever Herr Steinmeier thinks, the GCC remains for me the key to the Arab and largely Sunni Middle East. And security does not procure itself, particularly in this region. Expecting regional powers to produce a rebalancing of security, which is stable, will, in my view, produce a more severe unbalancing, which is why the Americans were there in the first place, which is why we were there before 71. So if the GCC faces choices, so do we. And if we think the broader stability of the MENA region, in general, the whole Arab Middle East, matters to us, in my case to Europe, which as of today still includes the UK, I'm glad to say, then what we choose matters. Saudi Arabia is probably even more disliked in the US than the current 2 presidential candidates, which is saying something. And everyone seems to love Foreign Minister Zarif for some reason. That escaped me, quite honestly. Maybe it's the beard. I don't know. Or his avuncular, the way he looks avuncular. What he says is entirely different. Nevertheless, I think the choice of the West, and I don't presume to say what Israel's choice should be, needs to be, first of all, to back the GCC. Above all, Saudi Arabia, for the long term, not to ignore or reject it. Now, this is going to be a bumpy ride. We all know that human rights, the position of women, intolerance of dissent, and so forth, are all headline discontents in the West. But Saudi Arabia has changed in the past and can change again. In 1971, I think it was, there was a cardinal in cardinal's red robes walking down the streets of Riyadh as they tried to conclude a concordat with the Vatican. You used to be able to get booze in Saudi Arabia, semi-publicly, as opposed to clandestinely, which is what happens now, of course. The UAE in particular, look at all the surveys, look at the polling results. The UAE in particular has got a model of liberalism, lifestyle liberalism, that attracts other young Arabs. It's fascinating to see this. You wouldn't have thought that in 1983 when I first went there. And we certainly need to avoid framing this, for me, as a choice between Iran, where the situation on many of these issues is in many ways a lot worse, and Saudi Arabia. This is not a binary choice. And we and the GCC need the US. And I think this whole issue of where the next US administration is going to be on all these is for me, it's a little imponderable, but it's fascinating. Whether we've seen a secular shift in the US or whether this is just a tweaking of the US position, I don't know the answer to that, but I wish I did. And I think this is achievable, because it has to be. Because if we collectively get this wrong, and this is a collective choice, I think, in the end, we'll face real problems. Because if we think the collapse of Syria and Iraq is bad, then Daesh in Medina, Al-Qaeda in Mecca, and Ayatollah Ali Salman in the Royal Palace in Rafah will be a whole lot worse. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now open for questions, comments. Bob.
Lieber, Georgetown. My question is equally for General Amidror and for Ambassador Jenkins. If the prospects of movement on peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians remain extremely poor, what are the practical modalities of moving forward with various Arab or at least Sunni states, UAE and so forth, maybe based on at least rhetorically working with the Arab peace plan, even though it's deeply problematic? Are there simply limits beyond which you can't go, or are there real possibilities that this could lead to something? And again, I come back to the problem that as much as one might want progress on the Palestinian front, that the absence of a strong, coherent political Palestinian framework, coupled with the deep objection to ending the conflict and ending claims, makes an Israeli-Palestinian final agreement almost impossible for the foreseeable future.
Any of you?
I think that we have to make the distinction that I try to do unsuccessfully between the negotiation and the agreement. I think that although there is a huge gap between the two sides, if both the Americans and the Europeans will put pressure on Abu Mazen, something that they were not ready to do in the last 5 years, the Palestinians, and now they will get a lot of help from the Arab countries, Sunni countries, negotiations can be resumed. About the agreement, you are more than right. The gap between the two sides about substance is huge, and I'm not sure that after a year or two of negotiations, an agreement can be reached by both sides. But I learned through the other negotiations with the Egyptians, in which I was very young, and the Jordanians I was older, and with the Palestinians then even older than that. You know how you begin the negotiations, but when you are in, it's a totally different story. And this is why I believe that instead of dealing with all the details of how the agreement will be look like, that so many people are wasting their time about, the focus should be how to bring the two sides to negotiate. And then during the negotiations, they will find what are the real gaps, where they are ready to compromise. There is a price to break the negotiations. There is no price for the Palestinians not coming to negotiations. This is why I believe it is so important to bring the two sides. If you ask about the agreement, I really don't know. If you ask about can the Arab states, with help of the Americans and the Europeans, can bring Abu Mazen to negotiations, the answer, I really believe that they can. They didn't try.
I got three things to say. Really, two are stories and one's an idea. The first story, I remember when Rafah was reopened in 2005, and I was Consul General in Jerusalem at the time, and I went down to Rafah. I was supposed to be speaking because we were the presidency of the European Union, and I was sitting right in front of Zahar. I was trying to keep out of camera shots so I didn't get into trouble in London. And Dahlan turned up. And Dahlan and Zahar embraced like long-lost friends. Now, I know that if it had been a very dark night in a dark alley...
One of them will go...
One will come out. So when people talk about Palestinian reconciliation or sulh and this sort of stuff, not so much. But I saw Dahlan again in November in Abu Dhabi at the Sabanias Forum. He and Salam Fayyad and Yasser Abu were there. And I said to them, look, you think this is a conference. Abu Mazen's going to think this is a conspiracy, particularly because of Abu Fadi. So the Arab states are maneuvering. I mean, they want their assets in this fight. But the idea is, Israel, the security issue, what Israel is offering the Arab states, and it's huge. You look at cyber. You look at issues of military supply, of command and control systems, ballistic defenses, all this sort of stuff. It's a lot. You look at the Arab Peace Initiative, I think the Arab Peace Initiative should have been the end of a process, not the beginning of a process. So in a way, the issue is how you actually construct that process which leads up to a rewriting of some sort of the Arab Peace Initiative. If Israel chose to use the leverage it has with Arab states, and it does because they need the sort of things that you bring to it, some of the things you bring, cyber and so forth, you have leverage in terms of how you frame what you ask of the Arab states in this context. I'm not saying what it should be. All I'm saying is you can turn that leverage, which is not being used, because that's just my idea.
Yes, please. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Professor Ben-Dor will now come up and give us the summation of the conference.